we need to be very clear at this moment in time what the backdrop was to these remarks from the president of the United States in Switzerland.
He offended allies. He makes it more likely that they're going to stand up to him. I think he subliminally sent a message to them was that their toughness recently has got him backing off a little bit on the threat to use force. We are not the pillar of NATO that we have been for 80 years, that we are now a threat to Europe. And that's what people are walking out of the room thinking.
The annual World Economic Forum in Davos was supposed to be about economics, artificial intelligence, and global coordination, but instead it has spiraled into a full-blown diplomatic disaster that is rattling alliances across the Atlantic. What should have been a carefully managed summit has turned into ground zero for one of the most serious crises between the United States and its allies in decades. At the center of it all is Donald Trump and his aggressive push to acquire Greenland from Denmark, a move that has shocked Western leaders and fractured trust that took generations to build. The chaos began when Trump made an extraordinary decision that stunned diplomats.
President Trump leaks what he says are private messages from European leaders concerned over his threats to annex Greenland.
He publicly leaked private diplomatic communications. First, he posted screenshots of private text messages from Emmanuel Macron. In those messages, Macron questioned the logic and strategy behind Trump's Greenland push, while still taking a diplomatic tone and suggesting a private dinner to discuss the issue like allies normally would. Instead of treating that outreach as confidential, Trump blasted it onto social media. Shortly after, he did the same thing with private messages from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who had also been attempting a quiet diplomatic approach. Both leaders were exposed publicly without warning and without consent. The fallout was immediate. Macron declined to meet Trump at Davos, a highly unusual and pointed move.
24 hours ago, French President Emmanuel Macron, effectively speaking for a great number of European countries, was very explicit about the threat that the United States president was posing to European countries. He said yesterday, we're shifting to a world without rules. Imperial ambitions are resurfacing, in which unacceptable tariffs are being used as leverage against territorial sovereignty, and that Trump wants to openly aim to weaken and subordinate Europe.
That statement alone sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Leaders rarely say things like that out loud, especially about the President of the United States. It was a clear signal that trust had been badly damaged. Things deteriorated further early Tuesday morning when Trump began openly questioning whether NATO and even the United Nations were the real enemies of the United States rather than China or Russia. At the same time, he began resharing content from fringe online accounts that most mainstream officials would never touch. For investors and foreign governments watching from the sidelines, this wasn't just inflammatory rhetoric. It was instability being broadcast in real time by the world's most powerful office. The financial markets reacted accordingly. Stock indexes slid as uncertainty spread.
The stock market plunging 870 points today over the president's insistence that he will take Greenland and will impose tariffs against NATO allies who don't support him. The president late today asked, how far are you willing to go on this? He said, you'll find out.
Yields on 10-year and 30-year Treasury bonds climbed sharply, a sign that investors were demanding higher returns to compensate for increased risk. Mortgage rates, which many Americans hoped would come down, moved in the opposite direction. The message from markets was blunt. Instability at the top translates into economic pain everywhere else. At Davos itself, the diplomatic pushback became impossible to ignore. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered one of the strongest rebukes heard at the summit. In a speech that quickly went viral among diplomats and policy analysts, Carney said, the world is not going through a transition, but a rupture.
We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons.
He announced Canada's full support for Greenland and Denmark, directly contradicting Trump's position. He reaffirmed Canada's unwavering commitment to NATO's Article 5 and emphasized that Arctic sovereignty belongs to the people of Greenland and Denmark alone.
On Arctic sovereignty, we stand firmly with Greenland and Denmark and fully support their unique right to determine Greenland's future. Our commitment to NATO's Article 5 is unwavering.
Carney went further, laying out Canada's coordination with NATO allies to secure the alliance's northern and western flanks, including unprecedented investments in radar systems, submarines, aircraft, and boots on the ground in Arctic regions. He openly opposed tariffs tied to Greenland and called for focused, serious diplomacy to achieve shared goals of security and prosperity in the Arctic. He even announced efforts to build a new bridge between the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the European Union, potentially creating a massive new trading bloc of 1.5 billion people, a move that implicitly sidelines the United States. Perhaps most striking was Carney's warning to other middle power nations. He urged them to stop pretending the rules-based international order still functions the way it once did. Compliance, he said, does not buy safety when dealing with hegemonic powers. That message resonated deeply in a room full of leaders who were watching U.S. behavior with growing alarm. Soon after, Macron took the stage himself. He never mentioned Trump by name, but no one in the room doubted who he was talking about. He spoke about choosing respect over bullies, science over conspiracy, and the rule of law over brutality. He framed Europe as a place where predictability, law, and stability still matter, even if reforms are needed. The line landed hard. Europe, he said, prefers respect to bullies. The applause was telling. Belgium's Prime Minister Bart de Wever followed with perhaps the bluntest warning of the entire summit. He said Europe had tried appeasement, but too many red lines had now been crossed. Leaders, he warned, face a choice between preserving self-respect or becoming miserable slaves. Backing down now, he said, would mean losing dignity, the most precious thing democracy has. It was language rarely used in diplomatic forums, and it underscored just how severe the rupture has become. The European response wasn't just rhetorical. Ursula von der Leyen announced a massive European investment surge for Greenland. The European Union is moving to strengthen Arctic security partnerships directly with Greenland and Denmark, bypassing Washington entirely. She emphasized working hand-in-hand with local governments to support infrastructure and economic development, a clear signal that Europe is circling the wagons. Meanwhile, Trump administration officials were left trying to defend the indefensible. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick appeared on multiple Davos panels attempting to justify the Greenland strategy. The reactions from European finance ministers and foreign policy leaders were unmistakable: discomfort, disbelief, and open contempt. When asked directly about Greenland, Lutnick brushed off concerns, framing the issue as purely about U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere and suggesting the rest of the world depends on America being strong to take care of them. The room visibly recoiled. Lutnick then went on to attack Europe's energy and manufacturing policies, falsely claiming Europe does not make batteries and accusing it of making itself subservient to China by pursuing net zero goals. European companies, of course, do manufacture batteries and battery components, making the claim factually incorrect. The arrogance of the delivery only deepened the divide, and the European officials on stage looked increasingly uncomfortable as he spoke. The damage didn't stop there. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent appeared on Fox Business from Davos and used the word conquering when discussing Greenland not acquiring or purchasing it. He confirmed that if Denmark does not give up Greenland, Trump plans to impose a 10% tariff starting February 1st, escalating to 25% by June. When asked whether the EU or UK might retaliate with financial measures, Bessent dismissed the idea outright, saying simply, no, just no. Given the tone of European leaders at Davos, that confidence may be dangerously misplaced. The situation escalated even further when Trump revealed he had invited Vladimir Putin to join something he called a Board of Peace. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky responded by saying he would not participate in any peace board that includes someone actively invading his country. When reporters asked Trump about Macron refusing to join this initiative, Trump threatened 200% tariffs on French wine and champagne and dismissed Macron as someone who would soon be out of office anyway. That moment crystallized the entire crisis. What the world saw at Davos wasn't just a disagreement over Greenland. It was a breakdown in diplomatic norms, an open disregard for alliances, and a pattern of behavior that has left even the closest U.S. partners openly alarmed, and this was only the first phase of the fallout. As the summit continued, the fallout only widened, because what leaders were reacting to wasn't just a single policy dispute over Greenland, but a pattern of behavior that many now see as reckless, coercive, and fundamentally incompatible with alliance-based diplomacy. The sense in Davos was that something had snapped. Long-standing assumptions about how the United States behaves with allies could no longer be taken for granted, and that realization was rippling outward in real time. One of the most damaging aspects of the crisis was the sheer brazenness of Trump leaking private diplomatic communications. In the world of diplomacy, confidentiality is not a courtesy. It's the foundation. Leaders can disagree privately precisely because they trust that those conversations won't be weaponized for domestic political gain. By posting screenshots of messages from Emmanuel Macron and Mark Rutte, Trump didn't just embarrass two leaders, he sent a message to every head of state watching. Private outreach to Washington is now a liability. That alone fundamentally changes how allies interact with the United States. Macron's refusal to meet Trump was a diplomatic slap that resonated far beyond France. European officials quietly acknowledged that if Trump was willing to publicly humiliate one of America's closest allies, no one else was safe. The French government's statement that it would not reward such behavior with a meeting was carefully worded but devastating. It signaled that normal diplomatic courtesies were being suspended in response to conduct viewed as abusive and unserious. Trump's early morning comments questioning whether NATO and the United Nations were enemies compounded that damage. For decades, U.S. presidents have sometimes criticized international institutions, but openly framing them as adversaries rather than imperfect partners crossed a psychological line. At Davos, where many leaders came precisely to reinforce multilateral cooperation, those remarks landed like a bomb. Officials privately described them as indistinguishable from rhetoric coming out of authoritarian capitals. The economic consequences were not abstract. Investors are exquisitely sensitive to political instability, especially when it comes from the United States. As Trump's comments ricocheted around the globe, markets responded immediately. The rise in long-term Treasury yields signaled a loss of confidence in predictable U.S. governance. Higher yields mean higher borrowing costs, not just for governments, but for households and businesses. Mortgage rates, already painful, looked set to remain elevated. In other words, the diplomatic chaos was translating directly into financial pressure. Against that backdrop, Mark Carney's speech took on even greater significance. His declaration that the world is experiencing a rupture rather than a transition was not academic language. It was a warning that the post-war order anchored by U.S. leadership was fracturing. By openly backing Greenland and Denmark, Carney wasn't just opposing Trump's position, he was asserting that middle powers must now actively defend sovereignty and rules rather than assuming Washington will do it. Carney's call for deeper NATO coordination in the Arctic was equally telling. Canada's investments in radar, submarines, aircraft, and Arctic deployments were framed not as support for U.S. leadership, but as insurance against unpredictability. His remarks about trade integration between the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the European Union were widely interpreted as contingency planning, building economic structures that can function even if the United States becomes unreliable or hostile. When Macron followed with his own remarks, the tone hardened further. His emphasis on choosing respect over bullies and rule of law over brutality was met with sustained applause, not because it was poetic, but because it articulated what many leaders were feeling, but had been reluctant to say openly. Macron's framing of Europe as a place of predictability and legal order was also a subtle invitation. If the United States is no longer predictable, Europe is positioning itself as the stable alternative. Belgium's prime minister removed any remaining ambiguity. His warning about dignity and self-respect wasn't just aimed at European leaders. It was a rebuke of the idea that appeasement buys safety. The language he used was unusually stark for a forum like Davos, and it reflected a growing belief that backing down in the face of threats only encourages more of them. That mindset represents a major shift in European strategic thinking, one driven in large part by Trump's behavior. The European Commission's response confirmed that this shift is already turning into policy. Ursula von der Leyen's announcement of a massive investment surge for Greenland was not reactive charity. It was strategic positioning. By strengthening economic and infrastructure ties directly with Greenland and Denmark, the EU is signaling that it will actively counter attempts to coerce or isolate its partners. This is Europe moving from rhetoric to action. In contrast, the Trump administration's representatives looked increasingly isolated. Howard Lutnick's panel appearances were particularly damaging because they revealed how out of sync the administration is with European reality. His insistence that the Western Hemisphere matters to America in a way that implies dominance rather than partnership reinforced fears that the U.S. now views allies as dependents rather than equals. His attacks on Europe's energy transition and manufacturing capacity only deepened that perception. Claiming that Europe doesn't make batteries was not just incorrect, it suggested a dismissive ignorance that stunned the room. European officials could be seen exchanging glances, some visibly shaking their heads. The tone wasn't debate, it was condescension, and that mattered as much as the substance. Scott Bessent's comments escalated things further. Using the word conquering in reference to Greenland stripped away any remaining diplomatic pretense. It transformed what the administration had tried to frame as a negotiation into something that sounded openly imperial. His casual dismissal of potential European financial retaliation was equally alarming. European leaders know they have tools, and they know how to use them. Hearing those tools waved away as irrelevant hardened resolve rather than calming nerves. The tariff threats crystallized the stakes. A 10% tariff tied explicitly to Denmark's refusal to give up Greenland, escalating to 25%, was widely interpreted as economic blackmail. That kind of conditional punishment, linked to sovereignty, crossed a line for many European leaders. It reinforced the view that this administration is willing to use trade not as a policy lever, but as a weapon. All of this formed the backdrop for Trump's announcement that he had invited Vladimir Putin to join a so-called Board of Peace. In Davos, that move was met with disbelief. The idea of placing an active aggressor in a peace forum struck many as grotesque. Volodymyr Zelensky's refusal to participate under those conditions was widely applauded, even quietly, by leaders who saw his response as principled and necessary. Trump's reaction to Macron's refusal only poured gasoline on the fire, threatening 200% tariffs on French wine and champagne, while dismissing Macron as politically irrelevant, was seen as petty and vindictive. More importantly, it confirmed fears that Trump is willing to use economic punishment reflexively in response to personal slights rather than strategic considerations. By this point in the summit, the consensus was unmistakable. This was no longer a misunderstanding or a rough patch. It was a rupture, just as Carney had said. Trust had been damaged, norms had been violated, and allies were beginning to behave accordingly, not by waiting for Washington to steady itself, but by preparing for a world in which it might not. And looming over all of it was the realization that these events were not isolated. They fit into a broader pattern of erratic diplomacy, public threats, and transactional coercion. For the leaders in Davos, the question was no longer whether this approach was sustainable. The question was how quickly they needed to adapt to survive it. By the final days of the summit, what had started as shock hardened into something more consequential: recalibration. Leaders weren't just reacting anymore, they were adjusting their assumptions about the United States and planning around a future that looks far less predictable. The dominant question in Davos quietly shifted from how do we manage this moment to how do we insulate ourselves if this becomes the norm. That shift was reinforced by a striking contradiction that many diplomats could not ignore. Just months earlier, Trump's own administration had publicly supported the UK-Mauritius agreement on Diego Garcia. His State Department called it a major diplomatic achievement, and Trump himself praised the deal after meeting with the UK Prime Minister. Now, that same agreement was being attacked by Trump as an act of weakness, framed as giving away vital territory for nothing. To European officials, this reversal wasn't just inconsistency. It was proof that commitments made by Washington could be disavowed at any moment, even when they had been celebrated as successes. The confirmation Trump gave in a later interview only deepened the sense of alarm. He said flatly that the 10% tariffs tied to Greenland were 100% happening on February 1st if there was no deal, with escalation to 25% by June. There was no ambiguity, no softening, no suggestion of compromise. For allies accustomed to negotiation and signaling, this sounded less like policy and more like an ultimatum. And ultimatums, especially between allies, tend to produce resistance rather than compliance. That resistance was already visible. European officials began speaking more openly about contingency planning, about diversifying trade relationships, strengthening internal markets, and reducing exposure to U.S. leverage points. These conversations weren't on the main stage, but they were happening in side meetings, over dinners, and in private briefings. Davos has always been a place where subtext matters as much as speeches, and the subtext this year was unmistakable. Europe is preparing for strategic autonomy at a faster pace than anyone anticipated. Trump's threats toward France over wine and champagne crystallized the personal nature of the conflict. When asked about Emmanuel Macron's refusal to join the so-called Board of Peace, Trump didn't just brush it off. He threatened 200% tariffs and dismissed Macron as someone who would soon be out of office anyway. That kind of rhetoric landed badly in Europe, not only because it was insulting, but because it confirmed a fear many leaders already had, that policy decisions were being driven by personal grievance rather than strategic calculation. The Board of Peace itself became a symbol of the broader breakdown. Inviting Vladimir Putin while Ukraine remains under invasion was seen as deeply cynical, if not outright offensive. Volodymyr Zelensky's refusal to participate under those conditions wasn't controversial in Davos. It was broadly supported. For many leaders, it underscored the widening gap between Washington's posture and the lived reality of countries facing aggression. Even officials who tried to project confidence about America's position struggled to convince their counterparts. Scott Bessent's dismissive response when asked about potential European financial retaliation, "No, just no," was interpreted less as strength and more as complacency. European leaders know their financial systems are deeply integrated with the U.S., but they also know leverage cuts both ways. Hearing those possibilities waved off only increased determination to explore them seriously. Howard Lutnick's comments lingered as well, not because of any single line, but because of the worldview they revealed. His framing of the United States as the indispensable power that others depend on to take care of them felt outdated to many in the room. The world he was describing no longer matched the one they inhabit. Multipolarity isn't theoretical anymore. It's operational. And rhetoric that assumes automatic deference now sounds more like denial than leadership. One of the most telling moments came not from a European leader, but from a U.S. one. California Governor Gavin Newsom, speaking from Davos, openly criticized what he described as global complicity and weakness in the face of Trump's behavior. He urged leaders to stop rolling over, to stop playing both sides, and to stand tall. His remarks were blunt, even abrasive, but they resonated because they reflected what many in the room were thinking but couldn't say as heads of government. Newsom's comments underscored an uncomfortable reality. The strongest critiques of U.S. behavior were sometimes coming from Americans themselves. That fact did not go unnoticed. It reinforced the idea that the divide is not just transatlantic, but internal to the United States as well. For foreign leaders, that raises its own set of questions about continuity and reliability beyond any single administration. By the end of the forum, the outlines of a new phase were clear. Europe is moving to deepen its partnerships with Greenland and Denmark directly. Canada is positioning itself as a stabilizing middle power in the Arctic. Trade blocs are being discussed that deliberately reduce dependence on Washington, and diplomatic norms that once centered on U.S. leadership are being quietly rewritten. What makes this moment so consequential is that it didn't arise from a war or a financial collapse, but from behavior, from leaked messages, from public threats, From rhetoric that treated allies as adversaries and sovereignty as negotiable, in Davos, leaders are used to managing crises. What unsettled them this week was the sense that the crisis was self-inflicted and ongoing. The annual World Economic Forum often produces lofty statements that fade once leaders return home. This year feels different. The speeches went viral. The reactions were immediate. The policy shifts are already underway. Trust, once broken at this level, is slow to rebuild. What remains to be seen is whether the United States will recognize the cost of this rupture in time to change course. For now, allies are acting on the assumption that they cannot wait. They are adjusting, hedging, and, in some cases, drawing lines of their own. Davos was supposed to be about the future of the global economy. Instead, it became a warning about the future of the global order and how fragile it has become when diplomacy gives way to coercion.